Before we get into today's video, I'd like to ask you a question. Have you ever thought about making money for game mastering? If you have, go to GameShopsBasement.com. There's a banner ad at the top that can take you some more information about learning how to do just that. And now, on with our feature presentation.
All right, folks, here we are. It is the second full week of 2022. It's time for our second weekly episode of Basement Banter. And like I promised last week, there's actually someone to banter with this week. So this gentleman is Rowdy Rory from Ireland.
Hello.
And he's going to start out as the guest. And then we're gonna initiate him into being co-host. So here at the beginning of the episode, I'm gonna kind of interview him so that you guys get a chance to meet him and stuff. And then when he's all interviewed and we give him the double thumbs up and he becomes co-host, then we'll finish the show with that format. So he's doing double duty today. He's guest and co-host. Rowdy Rory from Ireland. I guess introduction, we'll say, so Rory is one of the players here at Game Shop's Basement, and he and a couple of his friends there in Ireland, they started a private table. It plays on Saturday afternoons here in American time. But it's a private table. I won't get to play with Rory. That's not true, because he also plays in some public tables from time to time as his schedule allows. And if we start to get Rory fans out there and you catch him up on Discord, and beg him, maybe he'll play with you. So anyway, so Rory's been playing here at Game Shop's Basement. That's how he and I met. So that ought to be a pretty okay introduction. So now that he's been introduced, hey Rory, how did you find Game Shop's Basement and how did you get into D&D?
I've only just recently got into D&D. Well, just last year. We're now in the new year, I suppose. But I'm 30 years of age. I've always been into PC games, and particularly the more immersive the better, and I've always loved classic RPGs and even some of the kind of newer, weirder takes on RPGs that we've had in the last 5 and 10 years. Just when I was growing up in rural Ireland, I didn't have any real way of knowing about tabletop gaming. None of my friends in primary school or secondary school, all avid gamers, through the PS1, PS2, Xbox 360 generations, on PC, on Game Boys and all that. There was a lot of gaming around, but nobody I knew even knew what D&D was. So it wasn't until I was kind of in my early 20s that just picking up bits here and there through TV shows, and I kept hearing people refer to different PC games as it's taken inspiration from D&D. It's taken the mechanics from D&D and turned them into a game. And so I started, one of those things you hear about 10 times before you kind of think, well, what is this? I've always kind of wanted to do it then since I was in my 20s, but never had anybody to do it with. And it was one of those things that, like any new hobby you might want to do, it can be a little bit intimidating if you don't have a friend that has already done it. So I just ignored it for a while, and then just separately, one of my best mates, a guy called Owen, had mentioned to me that he would love to do it. Again, similar background to myself, had played games all his life, but had never had a chance, again, being brought up in rural Ireland, to play tabletops. And then also my fiance said to me that she would love, after the year in lockdown, she'd been watching a lot of D&D on Twitch and different streaming services, and she said, God, I'd really love to give this a go. So we decided to have a wee look on the internet, and I found startplaying.games, and in turn found John, and I'm very thankful that I did, because I was a little bit skittish about, just when you're new to something and you don't know how it's going to go. And as I say, even though I had two friends, or my missus and one of my best mates who wanted to do it, they still didn't know very much about it. So we were all kind of in the dark about it. But yeah, since we've started playing, we've kind of become addicted. So
Yeah, Your as I recall, your initiation was a little hard because seemed like for the first 3 sessions or so, the dice did not like any of you.
no, nobody
Like
did.
I have never seen a longer streak of poor dice rolls, and it lasted like 3 weeks, and it was all three of you, and you'd never played before, and I was just like, how is this even happening? And of course, we generally roll digital dice that you can see on the screen so that we've got public dice rolls. And I'm like, what? So, even if I was the kind of DM that would have fudged for you or something, I mean, you can all see what it is because I rolled it on the screen.
Yep.
So, oh, it was bad. But none of you actually died, neither you nor your characters, so it was all right. But before we go on, though, the way you talk about growing up in rural Ireland just gives me flashbacks to me growing up, because when I was that age, I was growing up in the cornfields of Nebraska, and it was the 80s. I mean, there was no internet yet to speak of. I mean, certainly not in the form we have today. I mean, when I was growing up in the cornfields of Nebraska, I mean, I was at a school where we took computer classes on a Commodore 64. So, but we knew my joke at the time, and probably, I mean, still, I guess if I talk to that, because I'm telling the joke again now, is that in the 80s, when those Stephen King Children of the Corn movies came out, we knew, us Nebraska kids, we knew that there were towns out there that could disappear and nobody would ever know, because we lived in one. So, yeah, it was it could be hard sometimes if you were a nerd, or you had an interest that maybe no other. Yeah, so you had to kind of go out, and I had to get people interested in D&D.
Yeah.
I had to like recruit people to play with. But so what was it like then? I mean, obviously, you said you liked it, you stayed and everything. What were those first few sessions like as a newbie?
Well, the very first session, I'll be honest, both Owen and Amy, I think Owen had briefly played with a group at his university, but like very, very short lived, like a couple of sessions at most. So he did have a little bit more of an idea about how you kind of manually build your character and have to remember different stats and different modifiers. Amy as well, having watched streams, was a bit more aware of that. I wasn't. I kind of very lazily went in thinking, well, not thinking, just assuming that it was a bit like a video game where, yes, there are all these stats, but the computer takes care of them for you. So you just click a few buttons to build your character, and that's all you have to do. So I suppose that's the part I struggled with, was having to kind of, there isn't really much maths involved, but just if you're not of that mindset, and I'm certainly not, I didn't expect that the first time round. The first session was a bit difficult for me because it didn't feel like fun or recreation. There was too much I was trying to keep track of. But at the same time, the thing that kept pulling me back to it was, well, I want to find out what happens when we go around this corridor. I want to get to the end of this castle, kind of a thing. So that was what was really driving us through the initial sessions. And like we were in a group chat, and we just kept talking about it during the week about, like, I wonder what'll happen if we do this next Saturday night, next game. So it was really just that feeling of needing to know where the story went.
Right. So the story was like the bait that got you to go through
completely
the suffering of learning the mechanic.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, cool. So I'll have to remember sometime to ask You said Amy had watched a lot of the D&D podcasts and video shows and stuff. I'll have to ask her sometime how I compare. But very cool. Okay, so I can see that there's guitar necks behind you and stuff. So
Yep.
so obviously you've got interests besides just gaming.
Yeah.
I noticed that, and of course uh, you've played in a few different games, but in the most consistent game, your main character, or at least the one that seems to be your main character, is is a human lore bard. So obviously the uh, music in real life, music in the game.
Yeah.
So we're going
Well,
with this.
that kind of is why I picked it, because it was like, even some of the classic RPGs I've played. Yes, you can nominally pick a bard, but I never really felt it had much meaning on the story. But yeah, as soon as I seen it, I just thought that's the rule for me. I kind of didn't even think about it. I was just like, yep, that one. I want to play a bard. Yeah, I have been playing music for years. I play a lot of folk and traditional music, and have done, I think, now for 15, near 20 years. When I went to university, when I was 18, I came across this fantastic and wide folk scene in Sheffield in England, and I ended up getting paid to play gigs and pubs and things like that, like multiple times a week. So
Nice.
I wasn't I was nominally supposed to be studying, but I was spending more time down the pub playing music and getting paid to do it than tending to my studies. But
It's easier to rationalize though if you're being paid.
well, that's just it, exactly. I mean, it's hard to turn down a good time at the best of times, which music and drinking usually are. But when you're getting paid to do it at the same time, it's just why wouldn't you? So yeah, I've kind of still fascinated and love playing music and like playing the role of the bard, particularly. It's kind of found it funny when making the character, and you've got all those little different bits, cantrips and spells and anything like that. But you also have, I'm not quite sure the right term, but you can pick like a starter pack and different things like that there. And I think I ended up picking cobbler's tools or something silly like that. But the other thing about it was that a bard has to pick 3 instruments, and like a lot of Irish traditional musicians, I play a couple of different instruments. So guitar would be my main instrument. I also play banjo, and I also play boron, which is an Irish frame drum. And I'd often, be hobbling from my university flat down to the pub on a Friday night with a banjo on the right arm, guitar on the left, and the boron slung over my shoulder. So when it was come time to build a character and you have to pick 3 different instruments for the bard, I very much knew how that felt.
Fair enough. Yeah. So one thing that I find kind of amusing about the whole thing is that most people in D&D want to get away from their real life as much as possible. See, like your character, Rory the Bard, he kind of embraces things that you find fun in life. But when I was younger, I would, and some new book would come out and, have some kind of new type of character you could play. And I thought I knew people, and I'm like, oh, I think this would be perfect for you. And, I was not thinking, I didn't understand what I understand now about people in life. But I picked up on it quick. Like, for example, one time, in Star Wars was going through a D20 phase. It was like D20 Star Wars, and there was a magazine. Actually had a magazine. It was actually on paper. It wasn't a website. I had a subscription, and there was a combat medic class that came out, and I had a friend at the time, and he had actually been a combat medic, like in the military. He had been deployed, and he could tell real life stories about crawling on his belly, with bullets flying overhead to try to drag people off the field of combat to a place where he could tend to them a little bit better and try to get out of there with them. And so I thought, oh, you've got here's combat medic for Star Wars. And he's like, oh, why would I ever want to role play that? I role play to escape, and why would I want to relive things that that have traumatized me? And I was kind of like, well, duh, okay, I guess that makes sense. I mean, I'm a little slow sometimes, but I do learn. And but yeah, so a lot of people, they they want to make a character to get away from the things that stress them in life, and so a character that reminds them of themselves is the last thing they want. But like the Rory the Bard character is really a way for Rory the player to you get to kind of go out experience to kind of experience that in ways that you may not, now that you said you were 30 and you said you have a missus and you probably have a job and responsibilities, and so going out and you probably don't get to have those kinds of experiences as often as you used to, and so now your character gets to have them.
Yeah, I suppose that's fair. Hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, that's definitely true.
So, well, very cool. So and I think one of the things that's really exciting about us co-hosting together is another thing that my irony meter just goes off. Like beep 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 beep. Irony here. It's like right now you represent way more of the D&D scene than I do, because there's more people coming into D&D every year than the year before. And it's been that way now for several years. And so when I talk to people for Game Shop's Basement and stuff, talking to new players and having session zeros and table forming meetings and stuff like that, people just reaching out to me on Discord. If I made a pie graph of the people that I talk to every day, somewhere between like half and 2/3 of those people have either never played D&D at all, they're looking for their first time period, or they've played D&D maybe a couple times, few times, but they're looking for a steady group. They've never had a steady group before. And so the people like me, like I'm 50, I've been playing since I was 30 or since I was 11, so I've been playing for 39 years. On that pie graph, people like me are like a little super thin sliver slice of that pie graph. And so like right now, Rory, you are to me, from what I can see on the gaming scene, you are like the face of D&D right now. Like you're definitely your perspective is like you are right where a lot of people are.
Yeah.
On it, and so I really think that that your perspective on things is absolutely important. So so I hereby induct you to co-host. So, and then one of these times, I think when we were talking about doing the show together, you had mentioned about one of these times, like flipping the script and you interviewing me or something, and so I was thinking, well, people hear me all the time, but I guess maybe we could save me for a reserve guest in the future sometime when we don't have another guest due to conflicts or something. But yes, so we're doing guests. So we're to use a gaming metaphor, we're leveling up. So last week we had a host, this week we have a co-host, and next week we're going to start having guests. So that's exciting. And so speaking of leveling up and adding things, I am happy to announce that we are adding a new game master at Game Shop's Basement. His name is DM Murray. He's from the Perth area of Australia, and his brand name as a professional DM is Perthrow Games. And if all goes well, I should have his bio up at gameshopsbasement.com tomorrow. He has not sent me a picture, and I'm not going to push him. I mean, I kind of nudged him a couple times, could you send a picture you're comfortable with? But, some people on the internet are shy. I get so, um, but yeah, so I'll have his bio up. He's absolutely amazing. I also met him through Game Shop's Basement. He was one of the early players. We started Game Shop's Basement in May, like the last half of May. So it's almost coming up on it. In a few more months, we'll have like a 1 year anniversary. But we started it in May, and I think Murray was already playing by June, early June maybe, and he is a ball in a group as a player. Like, yeah, he will keep everybody in the group laughing. And that's just on one type of character I've seen him play. I'm pretty sure if he can do that, he can play other types of characters. But he, couple of characters I've seen him play, one in Dungeons and Dragons and one in Marvel Universe. They are both like moody, emo teenagers with chips on their shoulder. He does that too well. I was a high school teacher for 14 years, so I know what teenagers with an attitude sound like. And he's just perfect at it. And it's about my age. He looks kind of like me, like balding white guy with a few extra rolls of fat, So he looks kind of like me, and yet he totally sounds like he could be some punk kid with a mature chip on his shoulder. He does it so well. He writes it into the story. So like for Mistara, this will be our segue into Mistara. It's Mistara news next. But it's an elven nation that got taken over by shadow elves from the Shadow Deep. So Mistara doesn't have drow. It's a different world. It has shadow elves. It doesn't have an Underdark. Well, it does, but they called it the Shadow Deep because they don't want to use the same name. So these shadow elves come up from the Shadow Deep, take over this elven nation, and the elves live 1,000 years. Elves tend to think of things in the long term. And so the elders of his clan, they have a long-term plan to take their country back. But because he's young, he doesn't have he thinks that his elders are lazy or stupid or just not, they're not patriotic enough. They don't have the fervor and the fire for their people. We should take our country back now, And so he's totally, in fact, he became a cleric, and he made it a point not to be a cleric of an elven god. He's totally rejecting the traditions of his people because he says the traditions of his people is what's holding his people back. So he's like an elf, but he's a cleric of Odin. Odin's a human god, and Odin's a god of humans who are warriors who fight. And but yeah, he does this whole. He's amazing. He'll really keep you laughing. Then the other character this past summer, we had a Marvel Universe campaign, and it was Strange Academy. So apparently, the comics. See, this is some stuff that can happen at Game Shop's Basement. I was advertising Marvel Universe. People were approaching me on Discord with different Marvel Universe character ideas. And these people did not know each other. They didn't collude or anything. Like this first person says, yeah, I'd like to play a magic user. I'd like to be Doctor Strange's apprentice. And then somebody else says, I have a magic using superhero that I used to play in another campaign. I'd like to transfer them over to your game. And somebody else said, oh yeah, I'd like to play Magic, Magik. That's a character in Marvel. It's actually Colossus's little sister, Colossus from X-Men. And she's one of the teachers at Strange. So then I noticed that in Marvel Comics, because if I'm going to be DMing this, I need to be up on what's happening in the comics. They decided to have Doctor Strange start a school for gifted magic people. I'm like, okay, so Professor X has his school for mutants, and now Doctor Strange is going to have his school for mages. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. So, but I thought it'd be a great campaign, and all these people seem to feed into it. So I start reading all the comics, get ready to run the campaign, And Murray's had already made his character though, and he was a mutant. I'm thinking, as the game master, I'm thinking, what can we do with this? And so I borrowed an idea from real life. In real life, we have exchange student programs. And so I thought, wouldn't it be a kick if Professor X and Doctor Strange had an exchange student program? And so one magical supernatural character went to the X Mansion, and one mutant from the X Mansion went to Doctor Strange's Strange Academy. And so, and Murray was just like, oh, he had such a chip on his shoulder. He was just like, and one day, like he'd been given these sarcastic comments all through the session. Then finally something happens that's so frustrating. It was almost like you scripted it in a movie. Murray's brilliant. He like boiled over, and his character actually gave a whole bunch of emotional exposition. And he's like, um, I get transferred over to this country from Australia because his character's Australian. So he's I get transferred to this country from Australia. I go to New York to the Xavier School. I'm there for like 2 weeks. Then I come down here where you magic people are crazy, and 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 it's like, and I'm like, wow. And then he just shut up and he was quiet. So we like boiled over once, like any of us would do, but especially teenagers that have been trying to keep things bottled in so long. Like, yeah, he's a brilliant. So I've never played in one of Murray's games as a DM, like where he DM'd for me. But if he plays this well when I DM, like the characters that I see, yeah, if time allows, yes, I will play in a game under him, and I'm very picky about who I play under. So if he can if he can play that well as a player, he's got to be a brilliant DM. So anyway, yeah. So Murray's our new game master here at Game Shop's Basement. So we'll have information about that up on the website tomorrow, as long as I get it up there. But so the so now I guess we get into the news from Mistara. Like I already kind of mentioned Mistara. So what's Mistara? Mistara is the D&D world that grew out of the original Red Basic box set. And then they followed up that original Red Basic box set with the Blue Expert set. And by the time they had the Blue Expert set, there was the first continental map of Mistara. They started mapping out countries and deciding who lived there and what their politics were like, and who didn't like who, and who liked who, and who was at war with who, and what their religions were like, and how they lived, and stuff like that. It's long story short, it's my favorite D&D setting. So it's the setting that most of our D&D games happen in. So for news from Mistara, all of our Mistara games are connected. So I've been calling it interactive Mistara. So what happens if you play, like in Rory's game on Saturday afternoon, stuff that group does might affect something that happens Wednesday night. And stuff that happens Wednesday night might affect stuff that happens Sunday night, or something Sunday night might affect something that happens, Monday night or whatever. So the idea is that we're putting the world is all together. We have worldwide events. I think we're getting ready to have like our 5th worldwide event here in March, where the storyline affects everybody. And the one example of what this means, what this can look like, is for your group, when you play it in Mistara and Game Shop's Basement, what it can look like is this is a little bit before Rory's time, but last summer, because Rory really kind of just started playing with us in the fall, but last summer there was a group that did a little bit of plane traveling, and they plane traveled to Ravnica, which, if you're familiar with Magic the Gathering card game, you know a little bit about Ravnica. Ravnica has this guild called the Simic Biomancers. And the Simic Biomancers, they actually know about DNA and gene splicing and all that stuff. And they had this little mutant creature that one of the player characters bought and brought back to Mistara. And if you've heard about invasive species, yeah, the creature got away, still kind of mutating because the Simic Biomancers had experimented on it, and it procreated. And so there were people on all different days of the week that were running into this creature's offspring. So, and the whole reason that existed was because so the consequences of what your characters do affects the world. It can affect people you haven't even met who play on a different day. So that's the closest that I can come up with to make our games at Game Shop's Basement kind of seem like an interconnected MMO. So I don't think Rory, I don't think your group has actually met anybody from another group yet. But I think you have heard, like, sometimes you've heard rumors and news of things that have come from other groups and other sessions.
Yeah.
So, uh, so like, so this is almost like I've been talking a whole bunch, and it's like, I need to kick it back over to Rory. And the natural question would be like, well, what do you think of Mistara? But that's not really a good question because, like, you haven't played D&D before. But I guess you have been into fantasy worlds before because you played all the computer games and you read books and seen movies and stuff. So, I know exactly how I can phrase it. Here we go. So just like playing ping pong, I'm hitting the ball over to you now. So, so is Mistara what you expected from D&D, like the world lore and everything?
No, but it's kind of better than I expected. I had assumed, but I'm not really sure why, but I had assumed that that most of the D&D campaigns would be quite linear quests, essentially, like, you know, whether it was dungeon crawling, you get to the end of it, and then that's it. And whether or not you carried the characters over, which is kind of how I knew that it worked, but it was just you kept kind of carrying them over into other campaigns or other things. I didn't really visualize it as a world. I assumed it was just kind of almost like chapters in a book, but that the book wasn't even, or that they weren't necessarily chapters from the same book. So it really kind of shocked. I think me and Amy and Owen, when you told us that, and I kind of almost thought, oh, maybe this is just a little bit of a blurb. Maybe this isn't actually how it is. But it is. So yeah, we have seen from, like, the events and the other campaigns that are going on in Mistara, just from the Discord, that, you know, not necessarily that we've affected any other group yet, but that definitely, like, they either go through similar things to us or in the same areas and have different results and things like that. So yeah, it's a lot cooler than I thought it was, because I didn't think that it would be so in depth, that it would be such a kind of networked piece of fantasy. I just genuinely thought it was just kind of A to B to C. That quest's done, move on to the next one. Even though you can still have a lot of player choice within one narrow quest line, but I didn't think that it was a world that you kind of, we the players could move about, and perhaps the DM wants to point us one way, but at the end of the day, if we wanted to, we could say, nope, sorry, John, we're heading south,
Yep.
not north. Yeah, so
Yep.
it definitely it was more than what any of us thought it was signing up to it. And in terms of you kind of get sad when you get near the end of any game or any campaign, because you kind of know it's over, you know, even if it's, well, because it's been immensely satisfying. If it's been a good story, you don't want it to end. But I suppose that's the nice thing about Mistara, that whilst one campaign within the world might end, you know, you move on to another place, and it doesn't even mean that you can't revisit the place where that campaign happened. It's not shut off, a bit like it is in video games, the kind of limitations of video games, that you just kind of proceed through levels. Even in RPGs that claim to be open world or whatever, you go to a certain area and for all intents and purposes it's closed off after you visit it, and you can't go back, and all the characters that were there usually aren't anymore. You can't interact with them. So it's given me a lot more joy than I've had from video games in years, because like anything else, once you have played a certain amount of video games, and obviously there's certain games that are a lot better, and certain developers that are, you know, bother to put a lot more time into games to kind of flesh out worlds and characters within those worlds. Even within that, you're dealing with, I suppose, a limitation of like the time that the development house had to put into the game and the engine that they used, the tech that they had at the time. So there's times in RPGs or immersive sims where the whole concept of the game is around multiple choice, that you don't have to follow one linear path, that you can pick your own kind of route and your own character. But more and more, I've kind of seen the kind of deception of that, and that, you know, it's really only two at most, or maybe three choices that they've actually given you. And yeah, there might be 10 options in the dialogue, but, you know, 3 of those options result in the same ending. You know, so I think that's what we've really enjoyed from Mistara and D&D in general, that we can kind of throw whatever we want at you, or whatever we feel is reasonable in the time, and it happens. It doesn't the game doesn't enter a failed state. You know, you just have to kind of roll with it, and you have. So.
Well, there have been times sometimes where I have to pause and think, and people will say, "Oh, John's resing the universe," you know, or no, or they'll say, "Oh, we're on a loading screen,"
Yeah.
you know, or if this was on an old if this was on an old MacBook, you know, we'd see this little circle symbol swirling on John's face or something. People have made jokes like that. But yeah, and one of the you know, my quick like comebacks, or one of my catch sayings to when people in D&D say, "Hey John, can I do this? You know, can I do XYZ? Can I do ABC?" is "Oh yeah, you can do it, and I'll DM it. It may not work the way you think it will, you know, but I'll DM it, you know, because in real life, our actions do not sometimes have the consequences we expected, you know, and so when you're in an action story in a fantasy world, you know, things do not. If you think about characters in Star Trek or Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, things do not always have the same effects that we expected. You know, in Star Trek, you know, when they're trying to save the ship from some mysterious force, they may try 2 or 3 things that don't work before they find the thing that does. Or you know, Bilbo Baggins, he thought that he just found an invisibility ring. He didn't you know, and really he did, because it wasn't until later that Tolkien decided about, you know, the lore of the One Ring and all that. You know, when the original Hobbit was published, it was just an invisibility ring, and it was just supposed to be a cute children's story. And then he decided to take that lore and make a much more adult story later,
And a whole world out of
so
it. Yeah.
right, so things don't, you know, Bilbo just thought, "I got a cool magic ring." He didn't realize that, oh, this is the One Ring, and it's an artifact, and it's warping my mind. You know, so like, you know, think just like real life, the consequences of our actions, we don't really, they're not always what we wanted or what we expected or what we were trying to get as our goal. And so, like for instance, in a lot of times in a role playing game, like in D&D, somebody will be casting a spell or something, and they'll be ready to quote to me, you know, out of the book or off their screen or something, exactly how the spell works, but it's not really working that way. It's like, well, and some players might have an attitude of, "Well, John, you're just not a good DM. You're not DMing the spell properly, you know, rules as written." And I'm like, yeah, but there's an effect in the story here. There's something going on in the story that's affecting your magic. And if you figure that out,
Yeah.
you know, then, you know, you know, like if you think about comic books, you know, if Superman's powers aren't working properly, or if Batman's gadgets aren't working properly, they don't suck their thumb and whine at the story writer. You know, they figure out why. You know, there's usually some kind of story reason why. You know, and so actually, well, that kind of gets me off into another topic too, which is the table guides and setting expectations. And this is actually a suggestion from GM Murray. So GM Murray isn't even here yet, and he's already affecting things. But he was suggesting that we put up table guides to. I've got some of them. I need to write more. At GameShopsBasement.com, if you look at the schedule of games, I've got a few table guides that I'm starting. But table guides are kind of like guidelines to help people know what's going to help them have the best experience, you know, gaming. And one of those things is kind of like understanding that there might be things happening in the story that might affect the way your powers work or whatever. And, there is a logic to it. And if you can figure that, but, just like just because your power doesn't work right away the way the book says it should work, that doesn't mean that the GM has lost his mind
up.
or anything. Yeah, that means there might be there's probably some kind of logic happening in the story. But that again, that's what makes D&D different than computer games.
Yeah.
Because it's much more open ended. Now, that's not to say that there aren't the expression for a game that is very linear, as we say, it's on rails, like a roller coaster or like a train. And there are plenty of D&D stories over the years that have been written on rails, and I do run them occasionally because some of them are very fun. Yeah. but you can't do that every week.
And certainly if you're time limited as well, I imagine that they work out better. If they're more self-contained than a.
Yeah, but if we did an adventure that was on rails every week and that's all we did, that would get boring. Yeah. And of course, the adventures on rail, like you said, when you're time limited, the adventures that are on rails require much less work from me. It's the open-ended world. Like I'll tell my wife, I have to study for this game coming up, and I use the word study, because it's like taking a college class or something. I need to make sure that I have reasonable understanding quickly in my head of what could happen in this situation based on where the party is and everything. And I'm not just talking about reading a couple pages ahead an adventure on rails. Anybody can do that. I'm talking about pulling out the map and figuring out what's going to happen to this part, looking up the NPCs. Like, okay, so the villain's motivation is really this, but the villain doesn't know about this over here, and these are the things that go through John's head when he's getting ready for a game, but that's a good question. I almost feel like I'm interviewing you again because I should have asked this before. It's so obvious to me now. Okay, so you've been playing now for a little bit. You think that you would ever DM?
Funny, I kind of discussed that with Amy and Owen, because we kind of just said to each other, about the split, I suppose, between the DM and the players. Like, we kind of asked each other that, like, do you think you could do that? Because it does seem a bit different than just simply playing. And initially I was like, no, too much maths. That was the part that I was saying that was putting me off. But then as we've gone on further and I've seen you do it more, and I've kind of seen, well, actually there's quite a lot of it that's just story and improvising. Mm-hmm. Like, maybe not completely writing something out of the blue, but definitely adapting to, okay, well, this has happened this play session. That mightn't have even been the thing that you... I'm pretty sure that's happened a couple of times in our game, that we've done something that that you haven't expected. I mean, you've definitely said that we've done a couple of things that other groups haven't done before just by accident. So I think that's really stimulating. Like, I think I probably would enjoy that because I've always enjoyed telling stories or jokes, even, elaborate stories. So yeah, I think it might be something I'd be interested in, but at the same time, it might be fine to do it to another group of people at my level, but you definitely, there's something to be said for the experience of it, obviously, because it isn't even just learning stats or monsters or anything like that. I think there's, like anything else, you can try and study or prepare for something, but I feel like, to be a good DM, you probably have to DM a few kind of bad or mediocre games before you get good. Like anything else in life, it's practice.
I mean, I'm not the same at 50 as I was at 40 or 30 or 20. Yeah. But it's kind of like the analogy that I've always used, and I got this from somebody else. I got this from the guy that actually taught me most of what I know about DMing. Was it comes from we've all had experiences with with injections, and we all know that there's nurses who are more experienced than other nurses. Yes. And so there are nurses that are much more skilled, and they can make it a much quicker, nicer experience than maybe that brand new nurse that
shoves it in your
and
arm. Yeah.
right, but the thing is, the only way to get to be the veteran is to be the noob.
Yeah.
You can't just skip being a noob. All those
Yep.
veterans used to be noobs. And so DMing is the same way as being a nurse and giving injections, that the only way to become smooth is to go through the rough times.
Yeah.
There's no other way that I'm aware of that it can be done. And yeah, so that analogy with the nurses and the injections, that was given to me by the guy that taught me most of what I know about DMing, a guy that I met in my late teens. And I'm actually thinking about trying to get him on the show and involved in Game Shop's Basement and stuff, because he was really, the guy that taught me everything I know pretty much. But anyway, but speaking of that, one of the things he taught me, though, one of the things I'd want to give you right now is about the DMing thing is the one thing really that allows me to think on my feet. He taught me is, what would a real person do? If you think about the NPCs as real people,
Aye.
what would a real person do? I was just watching a movie review last night, and the person doing the movie review, one of their big criticisms of the movie was that the script didn't have the characters talking like real people. It didn't have them behaving like real people. Like, that's not what real people would say in that situation. Or, that's not how real people would feel in that situation. And that makes a weak movie script. And so that makes a weak D&D world too. So if you ask yourself, what would real people do? So you can actually practice DMing by going about your life and just observing people. And noticing, like, for instance, I know a guy who has, he's an older gentleman, and he's in his 80s. It'll probably never get diagnosed, but people who know him kind of suspect that he may have undiagnosed Asperger's, because he doesn't really see people as individual people. He sees people as like archetypes.
Right.
This is the cafeteria worker, this is the taxi driver, this is the postman, this is he doesn't necessarily pick up on all the social cues that make us different from each other, and make our interactions different with different people. So for instance, when you go through the checkout line at a store, there's a big difference between the checkout person who just got there and is very young and their shift just started and it's payday, compared to this. But you could go through that same checkout line, and there's this person who is tired. Not only is it the end of their shift, but their shift is over. Their shift ended 2 hours ago, and the boss just told them that they had to stay because they're understaffed, and their feet hurt, and so that person is going to be a very different person to interact with than the first one. And so if we just look at real people around us in the world and look how real people are different, and then as when we DM, have your NPCs act like real people and respond like real people, that more than anything else will bring a gaming world to life.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, the guy that taught me how to DM, he even would base NPCs off of real people that he'd known in his life.
Well, that's definitely a way to make it realistic.
Yep. So if you have an NPC that you know is going to be a real jerk, base him off a real jerk you knew in your life. Or if you want to do an NPC who's kind of a very shy, insecure person, base them off of a shy, insecure person you knew in your real life. Another one of my sayings that I use a lot is, NPCs don't know they're NPCs. NPCs think they're people.
Yeah.
And really, to make somebody's character's life in D&D very juicy, is you want to give them lots of good relationships with NPCs, because the NPC, they say that the real life Earth has like something like 7 billion people on it, or over 7 billion people. So if we assume that D&D planets are about the same, um, the majority of the people around your character are NPCs. The only people that are PCs are like your party. No, so if you give your character any kind of a backstory or anything, your character's mother was an NPC. Your
Yeah.
character's father was an NPC. If your character has siblings, they're NPCs. Just last night, um, there was a character that gained a love interest. That love interest is an NPC. And so next week they're going on a date, and the party's going to follow. And I'm going to write it. And of course, I'm going to write it. I'm going to write it an adventure out of it, because of course the date's not going to go smoothly. It's going to kick off an adventure. Something's going to happen, because that's what makes these stories cool. So, but but yeah, so you make your NPCs, like real people, and then they'll be like real people.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's as well. One of the things that has always kind of annoyed me about video games, that particularly the kind of open world RPGs that are supposed to be most similar or most inspired by D&D, that you might have this really central character to a plot, and then the moment that the plot kind of like forks off from that character, that they might not, that they've only been there to serve the plot up to that point, and you might go back and try and talk to them, and they just kind of give you these voice sparks of like, you try and interact with them, and they'll say 2 lines, and then the 2 lines will just repeat themselves over and over again. And that's the thing I really like about D&D, that you can keep having conversations even with like NPCs that weren't supposed to be part of a quest or a party, that maybe just background kind of people, but you can keep talking to them or interacting with them and prompting them, and it doesn't stop. The game doesn't tell you no, basically, but video games definitely do.
Right. Yeah, that's why. Yeah, I mean, I've been into it for 39 years, but yeah, that's why these games are D&D and all the others. So speaking of D&D and all the others, I can tell this is going to happen here. Like, you and I have a tendency to just hang out and talk like buds, but we actually have like a segments we're supposed to do. So, so we'll have to find the right balancing there.
Sure.
But because what happened here was, when I thought about asking you if you thought about DMing, and they're like, well, yes, John, I have, and here's my thoughts about DMing. Then, of course, I want to help you, and so, oh yeah, let me tell you what I know. So it's just, see, it just sort of happens. But to kind of get more on
back on track
schedule here, yeah, back on track. So right, so it's good that D&D doesn't have to be on track, but our show should be on track. That's the take-home message here. Okay, so yeah, news from Mistara then. Some of these groups that are doing things that can affect other groups. So on Wednesday afternoon, there's one of our older groups, and older's kind of relative because we just started in May. So when May comes around again, we'll have like our 1-year anniversary. But this group, I think they started in June or July. It was one of those summer J months. But so they're one of the older groups. They meet on Wednesday afternoons. They're a public group. They have open spots at the table. And so you can find them on the schedule there at gameshopsbasement.com. But they recently kind of parked their Mistara characters and went for a flavor change. So for flavor change, sometimes you just want to try something different for a little while. They like their Mistara characters, want to come back to them. But they also wanted to try Matt Mercer's Critical Role world, Exandria. So right now, if you showed up on the Wednesday afternoon game, it's not Mistara, it's Exandria, but they parked their Mistara characters. One of the Mistara characters in that session is a forest gnome, Twilight Cleric, and he decided that he was going to use the downtime that his character's not adventuring to start an orphanage. And this orphanage, all kinds of plots and stories could come out of it. I mean, future player characters could come from that orphanage. Like you could say, hey, yeah, my character came from that orphanage. Um, or so if you made like a wizard or a sorcerer or something like that, you could say, hey, I was from the orphanage, and then one day I showed that I had magical talent, and so they put me in magic school or whatever. But the party also acquired a mansion in Gantry City, and they're kind of rehabbing this mansion. So for those of you who are familiar with some of the Gantry City in Mistara, there's a neighborhood in Gantry City, and well, Gantry City is kind of like Venice in real life. It's a canal city, and they've got gondolas and that kind of thing.
That's where the Winter
one,
Games happened, John, wasn't it?
yeah, it is where the Winter Games happen. That was our fourth event, because in winter the canals freeze over, and they freeze over so solidly that horses can pull sleighs on the canal, and the ice won't crack. So that is right. So see, living world. But in one of the neighborhoods was intended to be a very nice neighborhood when it was built, but then they discuss. So the architecture is grand, the scale of everything is grand, but then they discovered after it was too late that, kind of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa in real life, that side of the city is slowly sinking. Now it's very slowly sinking. Like the Leaning Tower of Pisa in real life goes back in time. Like Galileo apparently did one of his famous experiments about gravity in from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's been around for a long time. Now these days, if you look it up online, the only thing keeping it up is that they've chained it to nearby buildings, so it's getting a lot of artificial help. If it was totally given to natural forces, it would have collapsed by now. But the Leaning Tower of Pisa didn't just fall over in one day. It's been around for a few centuries. So this neighborhood in Glantry, it's not in any danger of disappearing like tomorrow or anything, but you can imagine what that kind of thing would have done to the property values. So what was supposed to be this super rich, nice neighborhood is now a slum. But those buildings are still there, and so the party acquired a mansion at cut rate prices. Of course, the mansion had like homeless people, squatters in it, and everything, and so they're dealing with kind of rehabbing the mansion and stuff, and that's kind of happening while the characters are parked. Also, another one of the characters got married to an NPC. I told the story last week, actually, so I'm not going to tell it again. But it's part of Basement Banter #1, and but his character's going on the honeymoon with his new NPC wife. So they kind of parked their characters, and then they started new characters in Exandria, Matt Mercer's Critical Role world. And so that I don't know what Amy watched when Amy was kind of watching D&D during the lockdown year, but might have been Critical Role. Critical Role is like the biggest D&D podcast in ever since such things started. But so
it was definitely one of them, yeah, because I asked her about it actually after we'd spoke about it, and yeah, she gave me a list of names, but it definitely was Critical Role.
Oh yeah, well. Yeah, it's pretty big. So in other news, like in March, there's a hardback adventure called Into the Netherdeep that's coming out for Exandria. I've talked to the group on Wednesday afternoon. They're probably going to stay in Exandria long enough that we'll probably get into that and run that. And also in March, there's a new Marvel Universe attempt at a tabletop role-playing game coming out. The Marvel Universe that we use right now is from the 1980s. It's the original system, and that group is actually they're on Tuesday nights right now. We're going through the Time Wars trilogy, and they just finished the first part of the trilogy called All This and World War II, where they met Red Skull and Adolf Hitler and Captain America and Bucky before Captain America was frozen in the ice and Bucky became Winter Soldier. So a lot of that adventure happens in 1943. And they finished All This in World War II. They kind of moved into the second part of the trilogy that's called The Weird West. and the party has found themselves in 1871 near Dodge City, Kansas. And so there's a lot of goofy time travel, comic book, Marvel Universe, cartoony fun happening on Tuesday nights. That is a public group. There's spots open. See what else is going on here. In a couple weeks, Monsters of the Multiverse will come out. That is a D&D product. It is a Monster Manual replacement, not a Monster Manual expansion, Monster Manual replacement. And I heard last night during the game, there were some players talking about it, that some leaks have been made. Apparently, some pages of it have been slipped onto the internet, and there are a lot of D&D players that are apparently upset because some of their favorite player character species have been nerfed, which I really don't care about. What I'm hoping for is that the monsters can hit characters again. Now, yeah, so you guys know Rory, and Amy and Owen in Ireland. They haven't been playing very long, so their characters are. I mean, what would you say? You guys are probably about 5th or 6th level now.
7, I think, as of the last game.
Okay,
yeah.
Right. So you guys are still low enough level that monsters are challenging you. So you might not relate to what I'm about to say yet, although if this continues, you will. The monsters now in 5th edition, they literally cannot hit players anymore. A few nights ago, I was doing these trolls, and the trolls had +7 to hit. They were stock trolls right out of the monster manual, +7 to hit. These characters had armor classes where the trolls could not hit them without a critical hit, natural 20. And so there was one fighter that just a Minotaur champion fighter just wades his way into these trolls, and there's 3 trolls. They have 3 attacks per round, claw, bite. So 3 times 3 is 9. That's 9 attacks. One of them hit because it happened to be a natural 20. So that 3 trolls jumping 1 fighter. So and the thing is, I could do an armor class audit, and I could show that this guy's armor class is legitimate. So it's not the player's fault. I mean, and it's not well, John, don't give him so many magic items. Well, the thing is, by the time you adventure and get some experience, and like these are not, they're not running around with artifact suits of armor or unstoppable. Like, yeah, it's just. Yeah, the game is broken. It's very frustrating right now. Yeah,
that begs the question, I suppose, that has kind of been lingering in my head. Just to go back to what we were speaking about when you were saying to me how my expectations of like D&D were met with Mistara and it being a living world, and I was saying, I kind of assumed that D&D was these kind of like disassociated chapters. With like, completely just the story didn't necessarily need to continue in any way. It was just like you're thrown into this dungeon, you're in this castle, you're in different locations. They're not necessarily related. They're all self-contained stories. For whatever reason, I just assumed that. I don't know why I did. But I suppose one of the things is like when you're meeting these kind of lower level monsters, like when we first met them, we were rolling dice for multiple sessions to get out of like the 1 or 2 encounters. We were getting our arses handed to us. And that was partly bad luck on the rolls, I suppose, more than anything else. But even now, yeah, we've had some of those encounters with the lower level things, and it Owen's blasted them with magic missile, and that's it. It's over. So, and that we're only level 5, 6, 7 when that has happened a couple of times now. So I suppose how I've kind of wondered that. How do you manage that going, like, as characters level up, or sorry, as player characters level up, and we move through the world, not even necessarily in any fixed order at all. Like, you're throwing campaigns at us that are, written in the last couple of years, and then we go back to the 1980s, and then we go forward again, back and forth. So there's no rhyme or reason to it. How do the monsters, like, do you match the levels to us, or is it supposed to just be fixed in the story? Like, oh, those trolls have the armor class of 7, it can't be greater or less.
Or well, it's a hit roll of 7. Yeah. So yeah, basically, so what I do is, since we're all supposed to be using 5th edition now, so if I whip out a if I whip out a first edition module, it's got trolls in it, I'll use the 5th edition trolls. I'll just substitute.
Yeah.
So I'll use the first edition module as a guide for the story.
Sure.
I'll use the 5th edition mechanics. So that's what I'm doing there. But yeah, so there's a couple of things to your question. One of them is about the game itself, and then the other part of your question is how do DMs handle it. So as to the game itself, the game is always, in all the editions of the game, have always had feature creep or power creep. And so with 5th edition now, 5th edition came out in 2014, and people have noticed in the past couple years that the characters that you could build with the player's handbook don't hold a candle to the characters that you can build with Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. If you look at the fighter types in the player's handbook, the champion and the battle master, and then you look at last night there's a character who's a rune knight fighter, and the rune knight fighter is using all this cloud giant trickery and fire giant binding chains and all, so there's definitely been a power creep thing. So Monster Manual, the 5th edition Monster Manual came out in 2014, because 5th edition came out in 2014. This is 2022. It's been 8 years, and every edition of the game has always had this power creep. We're 5 editions in now, and this has happened every time. So what I'm kind of looking for is for the monsters to, I mean, that's why they're doing a new Monster Manual, because so that's what the game. Then what do DMs do about it? Well, one thing that I do that that Mistara did first. Okay, Ruhu Mistara, it's my favorite world, and my the DM that taught me how to DM did was there used to be a time when, these days, if you want to make a character and you want your character to be an orc, that's no big deal. Nobody even thinks twice about it. Or if you want your character to be a hobgoblin, or you want your character to be a kobold or something, or a gnoll, like this rune knight fighter we're talking about is a gnoll. The rune knight fighter gnoll's the one that has the date we're going to do next week. But if you want your character to be a species that we typically used to consider the monster races, that actually didn't used to be a thing. Like when a D&D first came out, it was like assumed that you were going to be a human, a halfling, a dwarf, or an elf. That was like original D&D.
Right, yeah.
And so the idea that people might want to play some of these other species, especially species that were traditionally going to be enemies of humans or enemies of the more civilized lands, this was a big deal. Now nowadays in 2022, it's no big deal. But back in those days, though, the idea that an orc might have fighter levels, instead of just that orc being the stock orc from the Monster Manual, that orc might be a 10th level fighter. And if that orc was a 10th level fighter, then they would have all the hit points of a 10th level fighter. They'd have all the abilities of a 10th level fighter, and they'd mess you up. Now, is every orc a 10th level fighter? No. Most orcs are going to be that stock orc from the Monster Manual. But the orc that's a 10th level fighter, that would be like a king or a general, or or they'd have some special story, like they were captured and they were young and thrown in the gladiator pits and they survived all these years. There'd be a reason why they had risen higher than the normal orc. So now I haven't, but I could, if I really wanted those trolls to be tough, I'd give them classes and levels. So the standard troll in the Monster Manual right now has +7 to hit. But if I, as the DM, decided that these trolls had classes and levels, which usually if a troll would have a class, it'd probably be barbarian. But yeah, so if these trolls had classes and levels, then they would have more than +7 to hit. But creatures like that have classes and levels, I think they should be rare. There should be a reason in the story why they're the exceptional ones. And if we think about MMOs, when enemies in an MMO have like a floating colored nameplate over their head, depending on the color code in that particular game, there's like common enemies, and then there's like tough enemies, and then there's like boosted enemies, So it's kind of like that. Like that's one thing that a DM can do, and that us DMs have been doing for years. Is we'll take some of the traditional monster races and give them classes and levels, because why wouldn't they? And eventually the writers of the game came to that conclusion too, because now they're all player character races.
Yeah.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Rory the Bard is a human.
Yeah, wasn't too inventive with that. Just stick with what I knew. But so if there's a new monster manual coming out, and the last time there was a new monster manual came out, it was coincided with, 5th edition, the game kind of moving on to a new edition. Why isn't it 6th edition now? Is there a reason for that, or?
Well, the company doesn't ask me how to run things, but from what the blurb on the internet is that 2024 is going to be the 50th anniversary of D&D, and so 2024, yeah. So 2024 is supposed to be 6th edition, according to what the blurb on the internet is now. So 2024 is going to be 6th edition, but the monsters really need to be fixed now,
right?
And and also 5th edition has more internet support. Like, the internet didn't exist before, so there are D&D Beyond. Like, there are people that probably wouldn't be able to play D&D if it wasn't for D&D Beyond. Yeah. Like, D&D Beyond is like it's like D&D Beyond is like synonymous with how to play D&D these days. And so there's so much internet integration with 5th edition, with D&D Beyond being the biggest poster child example of it, but there's other things as well. But there's so much internet integration with 5th edition that if they were going to completely change editions, like, there are YouTubers that have hundreds of videos up that have based their entire careers on how 5th edition works. He doesn't pay me to do a commercial for him. I'm a natural, organic fan, so I'm going to rave about him. But people have heard me talk about Tulok the Barbarian, and he's got a Patreon that I support. On Patreon, you can actually see how much money somebody's making per month, and this guy's making almost $8,000 a month off of his YouTube videos. He's got hundreds of YouTube videos. They're based on 5th edition. What would happen? And his YouTube videos are about how to build characters. So what would happen if how to build characters changed too much? If how to build characters changed too much, it'd be like making him start over. So one interesting thing that I saw in an article in the news about 5th edition, where they were interviewing Wizards of the Coast rep people or whatever, some spokesperson, somebody said something, they put quotes around that came from Wizards of the Coast. But they said their new edition is going to be they can change things at any time. Okay, like if a book isn't out yet, they can change it. So just because they say something's going to happen doesn't mean it's going to. Yeah. Right. It's not set until the book actually comes out. But what they said, probably I think I read this in November, and it's January now. I thought it was very interesting. Was that the new edition of the game is supposed to somehow be backwards compatible with 5th edition. Like, whatever they think they're going to do, I have no idea how they would do it. But according to what this person said, somehow they're going to make a new edition where none of your 5th edition books come incompatible with it. And
that's never been the case before.
Well, yeah, not real. I mean, there was a 3.5, but still with 3.5, that was markedly different from the rules as written in 3.0. So, and
it was also called 3.5, which suggests, it's a half step, not a full.
So what some people are suggesting is that maybe they'll release a version of the game that doesn't have a number somehow, like they won't call it 6th edition. Kind of like movies stopped putting numbers after the name. Like when I was a kid, movies would movies would have numbers. There'd be Star Trek 1, 2, 3, 4, or Rocky 1, 2, 3, or they wouldn't put 1 in front of the 1. The 1 would sort of get the 1 retroactively after there was a sequel.
Yeah.
Rocky, there'd
I
be
know what you
Rocky,
mean.
and then Rocky, Rocky 2. But we reached a point where movies stopped doing that because I guess Hollywood decided that wasn't cool or what, or whatever. So there are I've read some speculation that they may try something like that they may try to make a new version of D&D, but not actually put a number to it and call it 6th edition. I don't know. Again, I don't know how they would do these things. I'm just reporting what I've read that they've said that they're going to try to do.
Right. Yeah. We can only wait and see, I suppose. It sounds interesting, but
we got 2
like,
years, and right. And I'm gonna sound like the old fogey again, I guess, because early in December they came out with the Strixhaven book, and that's a world-setting book based on a Magic the Gathering world adapted to D&D, and there's some spells in it that are just broken, awful, terrible spells, and there were people online in GameStop's Basement Discord. And not only were they having their own discussions in GameStop's Basement Discord, but then they were copying and pasting and quoting other discussions they'd seen other places online. And so I'm looking at my Discord feed and I'm watching people panicking about how broken these horrible spells are. And I sort of cracked my knuckles and got to the keyboard and put in my 2 cents. And I said, we've been here before, people. Okay, some of you weren't born. But for those of you who were born, we've been and I pointed out how the game has suffered through some terrible rules before. We all lived.
Yeah.
We all got through it, and I came up with like some specific examples, and I've talked about them in other videos. So this video's probably gone on long enough. I probably don't need to mention those here, but the game has had some crappy broken spells before. Particularly in without going into specific examples, just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, like when 1st edition changed to 2nd edition. Like I've got several examples and war stories I can tell about that. but the game's had crappy spells before that were really stupidly written, and we lived. The game made it. We're all here. So it just the DMs and the players just have to kind of step in and have some common sense at their table.
Aye. Which is the beauty of D&D, because you're not reliant on the publisher development house to patch it.
Right. that is the ultimate way that the table. Yeah, that is the ultimate way that the tabletop is superior, because if you're playing an MMO and your MMO gets patched, you can't re-roll that patch back.
Yeah.
Unless you get a whole bunch of people organized to make some sort of refitted server of their own. No.
And even so, they often get sued when they do that because they infringe the trademark.
Right. So there's no way to really roll back an electronic patch in a video game. But if you don't like 5th edition, I mean, you can still play 1st edition if you have the books.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or if you don't like a particular expansion, just don't use that expansion.
Yeah.
And that's really one of the coolest things about the tabletop games.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So other products coming out then, things coming up. We talked about March, how Call of the Netherdeep's coming out for Exandria. Monsters of the Multiverse is coming out later this month. There's a new attempt at a Marvel RPG, which we're going to try. I've pre-ordered it on Amazon. Take a look at it, see if we like it better than what we do now or not. And then, like we just said, it'll be our choice. And then next month in February, the Avatar Legends game will come out, which is Aang the Last Airbender and Korra the Avatar type world. They're getting their own RPG. So we'll see if there's any interest in people doing that. And I will probably collect it regardless, just as a fanboy. So whether or not I ever run it for anybody, whether or not there's ever any interest, because there's only so many hours in the day, there's only so many days in the week, you can't. I told my kids growing up with a gamer dad like me, they were just doomed. But I told him that even if all of the gaming companies stopped making product right now, um, and we could game every day for the rest of our lives and not have to have jobs and stuff like that, there's no way we could ever game at all. Like we wouldn't even scratch the scratch of the scratch of the scratch of the surface of all the content that's already there, and we know they're not going to stop.
Yeah, yeah. We call it the backlog on PC. I have about 500 games in my Steam library that I don't have earthly hours to play. You know, I might like
and
to, but
I have a feeling that 500 number is probably it's probably scarily close to being literal and not just a big number you pulled out to exaggerate.
yeah, yeah, it actually is. And there's people a lot worse than me, you know, because it it's just the nature of it.
I remember getting that way with books, because I used to just devour books constantly. And sometime in my 20s, when children and jobs and second jobs and bills and all that kind of stuff comes along, I started not having as much time to read. And I remember that I still held on to it because I still loved it. But I remember the physical pile of books, on the table next to my bed getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. You start to kind of beat yourself up about it, but like, there's just no way of being able to stay on top of it. You have to kind of just learn to live with it. That you're not going to have as many hours, no matter how much free time you have.
Well, and they're putting. I mean, it's a bread and circuses society. They're putting so much out.
Yeah.
I remember reading a long time ago. This would have been like in the 1990s. This was a long time ago that I read this, but the idea was that people are starting to have mental slips at younger and younger ages. Like mental slips aren't just for old people anymore. And the essence of this article, the way that they were approaching that idea, was that if you measure information in bits and bytes, they were putting forth the idea that your average medieval person, who was like a serf, in a fiefdom in Europe that was like born and lived and died within 10 miles.
Yep.
The same spot, and they never traveled. They never went anywhere. They did their whole life, childhood and work and courtship and family and marriage or having kids or and then being an old person. Their whole life happened within 10 miles of the same spot. Said the average medieval person, the amount of bits and bytes of information that they needed to have in their brain to successfully conduct themselves through a life like that, they said would fit in the large Sunday edition of a large city's newspaper.
Yeah.
But just to give people like a physical representation of how much that was. But the amount of information that people need now, this article was from the 1990s, but the amount of information that people need now to successfully conduct their lives from birth to death, it's just it's like fighting against the current. And so that's what they were saying about how mental slips were happening more and more and more because it's a bread and circuses society now where it's all based on amusement and entertainment. It's not just that we get busier. Like in my 20s, I thought the problem was, well, I have 2 jobs and kids and a wife. I just don't have the time that I used to have. That's part of it. But also just the sheer volume.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's like a fire hose. And like you can't keep up with it all. So I remember there was one time that people are really fickle with MMOs. So I'm going to talk your language for a minute. I'm going to talk about computers. Okay, so people are really fickle about MMOs, right? Like as soon as there's a new shiny MMO, there's whole guilds that want to just pull up roots in the one MMO, and then they want to all go form the same guild again with another MMO. And so this one MMO is coming out, this new one, and people were trying to convince in my guild the guild was collapsing, and people were trying to convince me to jump games with them, and I'm like, and they were trying to tell me about all the technical aspects of why this new game was objectively better, and all the different innovations about how to play your character. The idea would be like, it should be more about your character than your gear, and so they've done these things to try to make it more about your character than your gear and stuff. That all sounds good, but the thing is, it's like you don't get it. Now, I've played it since then, and I'm a big fan since then. But at the time, it was Guild Wars 2. And the game that they were trying to get me to leave was Star Wars: The Old Republic.
Yeah.
So they were trying to get me to leave Star Wars: The Old Republic and go to Guild Wars 2. Now, I love Guild Wars 2 now, but back then, so what I told them, I said that you don't get it. I don't know that world, and I'm a Star Wars fan. Okay, like in 1977, I was 6 years old and saw Star Wars in a station wagon where my parents had gone to a drive-in movie theater, and my mom and dad and sister fell asleep and I was awake and saw it to the end. So the thing is, like, I'm totally into Star Wars. It's like you're trying to convince me that Guild Wars 2 is an objectively better game.
But it doesn't
which I agree
matter.
that it is.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter because I'm not a fan of that world.
Yep.
And it's like, and the thing is, and what I told, I don't want to become a fan of something new. I started listing off all the things that I'm a fan of. I'm a fan of Star Wars. I'm a fan of Star Trek. I'm a fan of D&D. I'm a fan of Stargate. I'm a fan of this. I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of this. It's like, I don't have room in my life for another fandom.
Yeah.
Right, because fandoms require investment and commitment. They do. And that's why fans will sour on something, because they want something to succeed, and then when the people in charge of that franchise put out crappy products, they're like, I'm so invested in your universe, and you put out this crappy product. So but they were trying to get me to play Guild Wars 2, jump ship from Star Wars Old Republic, and they were trying to convince me that it was a better game. And I'm like, okay, you convinced me it's a better game, but that's not what I care about.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely. Yeah. Did you ever play might be too tangential, but did you ever play the games that was based off that Star Wars Old Republic, or Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2?
I started to. I got them on Steam. There was I don't remember what year it was, but there was some kind of promotion where Steam was giving them away for free.
Oh yeah.
I don't remember. It was several years ago now, but so I picked them up at that time, and it really didn't hold my interest. So for one thing, a couple reasons. For one thing, when I play video games, I play them to be with people.
Yeah.
I like the idea. I like the idea that the person on the other side of that avatar is a real person in the world somewhere. And that when I type to them and they're typing back, that's a real person. But if I am just an electron avatar wandering around and everybody else is an electron avatar and there's no real people in there, like, I feel like if I had a PC tower here, it's like I'm running around in that PC tower all by myself. Right. And I'm like, what am I doing with my life? Because, because at least with an MMO, I can rationalize that I'm
fellowshipping. Social aspect.
Fellowshipping with other human beings, But for people that were into Skyrim when that was so huge around me in my peer group, I would just come over to their house to pick up something or to say hi or whatever, and if the lights were down and they were just glued to it, and I knew from conversation with them that they had gotten off work yesterday. They'd been at that computer since yesterday, and they'd maybe gotten up to eat and use the can, and
that was
I'm
it.
like, but
yeah.
But the thing is, again, you're just running around inside your tower PC. There's nobody there, And I don't know. We all game for different reasons, and we all like different things about gaming, and I don't know, it just doesn't feel right to me to be running around inside the machine by myself. I want to be with people.
When you say that, you nearly convince me, about the social aspect of it, and that's definitely a large part of why I game too. But I suppose when you have, and you don't necessarily know which games they're going to be or when they happen, but when you have games like Skyrim, which is not a perfect game in any way, even if you've played it, it's certainly not a perfect RPG. But it's kind of like a watershed moment in the culture that, because, as you say, everybody you knew for a period of time was playing it. In a weird way, it's not a social experience as you're playing it in your pants in front of your own computer, at 2 a.m. But it becomes a social experience when you're kind of, quoting it, 2 or 3, 10 years later, because it's 10 years now, to other people. So, yeah. You are right, but there is still, I suppose, something to it when you're in the moment and you kind of sense. It's very rare. I actually think it happens less now than it did even 10 plus years ago, that you have those kind of big games that actually happen to be somewhat good and everybody joins in and plays them, and it becomes a shared cultural experience, I suppose, at a distance. But yeah.
Go, sweetie. All right. But yeah, but we all play these games for different reasons. We all get dopamine hits in our brain, in different ways, and that's why these games are so appealing, because they can hit so many psychological needs. They can fire so many psychological buttons, and what one person plays the game for is not necessarily what the next person overplays the game for.
Yeah.
They might play for different reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's see here. Probably been gabbing for a while, so I think that hits. Oh yeah, so that pretty much hits the last bit of news that I have here on my list. We didn't mention. It's about Shadowrun. So Shadowrun's not a new game. Shadowrun came out in 1989, but there are 2 groups of Shadowrun tables. One is more public than the other one, and I'd have some spots in it. But the every other Friday, they alternate Fridays. So there's every other Friday and then every other Friday. But yeah, Shadowrun is that's going to take off. Like there's a group going to take off tomorrow, like their very first one. So at least their first one with me. They're like experienced veteran Shadowrun players, and they actually asked me, "Would you consider doing Shadowrun?" And I typed back, "Well, absolutely. I miss Shadowrun." So Shadowrun is you can explain it, but it doesn't really do it justice. Like the explanation is Cyberpunk plus D&D. That's the. I mean, but you say that's accurate. Just to say it's Cyberpunk plus D&D, that's an accurate explanation, but it doesn't really do justice as to what that actually feels like to play. When I first played Shadowrun as a player, I was playing a mage, playing a magic user, and yet I lived in an apartment, or my character did, and so my character had car keys in his pocket for a car that was parked outside, and he was eating food out of a fridge.
Yeah.
He paid for with American dollars. A lot of people think that the default currency in Shadowrun is New Yen, and I guess it is the default currency because it's the world currency at that time. But other countries have other currencies, and there is a bit of America left in Shadowrun. So, but yeah, Shadowrun is Cyberpunk plus D&D. In the latest materials, when Shadowrun started in 1989 in real life, they set the year at 2050. So now, if you look in the latest product, they've advanced the timeline so that it's 2080. But and the original company that has it now is Catalyst Games. The company that started it was FASA. The original developers back in the day at FASA said that the biggest inspiration for the feel of the game was the original Blade Runner movie.
Right.
So that was what they gave when they were trying to explain it back then, because very cross genre. It's got magic and a virtual reality matrix, and elves and dwarves and trolls and dragons and machine guns and grenades and tanks and and it's all that stuff is all mixed in there in a very dark cyberpunk world. So the world setting basically, since magic came back to the world, they figured out what would that look like. So I mentioned there's a little bit of America left. What happened when magic came back to the world in their timeline is that like the Native American shamans got all very powerful and everything, and so the Native Americans started clearing their land back to be theirs. And so in their timeline, when America sent the military in to occupy the land, earth elementals came up out of the ground and just picked up the tanks and threw them around. And storm spirits came out of the clouds in the sky and just swatted the F-16s around and stuff. So in the Shadowrun universe, like I live in St. Louis here in real life, everything west of the Mississippi, everything west of me, in Shadowrun has been given back to not really, they took it back and kept it. so America basically was America's just became the eastern part of the United States again. And then for some reason the Shadowrun writers had the Confederate South break away again. And now not in some sort of weird pre-Civil War way. It wasn't sort of like, let's start slavery again or anything stupid like that. It was just more like, we don't think we have economic interests with
cultural
the North.
divide,
yeah. Right, that kind of thing, yeah. So the South broke away again. So what was left of America kind of buddied up with what was left of Canada. And because the whole western part of Canada got taken by Native Americans as well. Yeah. So the northern part of the United States merged with the eastern part of Canada and called themselves the United Canadian and American States. So in Shadowrun, they basically came up with a world timeline of what if magic came back to the world? What would that, what would happen if the world had D&D magic? and it's been, so the first thing that happened even before the Native Americans took their land back was the dragons woke up. Dragons had been sleeping under the Great Mountain chains for thousands of years because there wasn't enough magic for them to stay awake. So when there was enough magic left in the world that the dragons could wake up, dragons kind of flew around the world, observed how the world had changed and how the world worked these days, and then they went back to their lairs, grabbed their treasure hoards, and then used their treasure hoards to buy controlling stock in major corporations. And so in the world of Shadowrun, many of the corporations are run by dragons. Because the idea is the dragons just adapted to the
modern times.
To the way the world works now.
That's a good twist. I like that.
Shadowrun is very trippy. I've noticed that it's gotten very dark though, because it came out in 1989. I'm an 80s child, and so even in the 80s they had apocalyptic fiction. They had Mad Max and Beyond Thunderdome and Running Man, and they had stuff like that. But in the 80s they thought the future would be very neon. So lots of neon in 80s futures. And they tended to in 80s prognostications about the future, there was still this idea that yes, the future will be dark and bad, but the human spirit will still be there looking for an opportunity to rise up. And I don't see that anymore in fiction about the future. In fiction about the future now, and I noticed it in the latest Shadowrun products because I'm learning them, reading them, studying them so that I can run Shadowrun properly. And by properly, I mean competently and well, and give people a good immersive experience, feel like they're really in that universe.
Sure.
But I'm studying it, and it is dark. Like, instead of what I kind of remember in the 80s from the future will be dark, but the human spirit will still be there, ready to rise up. It's not, the future will be dark and you're just going to be ground down and there's no hope. And that's that, I don't know. That seems to be like what I see when I look at science fiction and movies and books and comic books. That seems to be what the future, the idea of the future now. It's not as
it's much bleaker.
It's not as upbeat.
Yeah.
It's not as upbeat and neon as it was in the 80s. I need more neon and cheese. Lots of 80s cheese.
Yeah, well, digital's to blame, I suppose, for the lack of neon, and God knows what's to blame for the for the lack of hope. But yeah, fiction is definitely darker. It's a lot more apocalyptic, but that's a broader topic.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But I thought it was kind of significant about the the
Sure. Yes,
Shadowrun, since we're bringing
that
that
in
in.
itself is an
Yeah.
example. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's how you notice it as a trend, is in the individual things, I suppose.
All right, well, especially as I've seen it change. Because I
Absolutely.
was there
Yeah.
in 19. I was there. I bought the first edition book in high school. I graduated high school in 1990, so I bought the first printing of the first edition book in 1989 with money from my high school job. So I mean, yeah. So I have seen it change.
I think
Uh,
the kind of inverse of that is it's definitely one of the reasons that I enjoy D&D for its medieval setting, as it were, or certainly not modern day, is that I don't have to think about any of the dystopian stuff. You can kind of just live in that fantasy world, and you don't need to think in any way about modern times or where we're going. It's definitely a big plus about it.
Right.
And it is therefore a lot more hopeful in that way.
Absolutely. Because even the in fantasy trope like that, even the darkest situation can be turned around.
Yeah.
Because Frodo and Sam can find the cracks of Mordor.
Yeah. Exactly. So I suppose in a weird way, when we're having the conversation at the very start, when we're talking about like what type of player character you want to be, and I picked Bard, and you were given that example of a friend of yours who'd actually been a combat medic and how he didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Rightly so, in his gaming time. I suppose that the world itself is kind of, it's not a happy place, but it's a happy place by comparison when we're talking about cyberpunk dystopia, I suppose. And
Yeah.
that's still a game world that has an attraction for me, but I definitely feel a lot more chilled out in a D&D setting than I would in something that has so many more concurrent threads with our times than I suppose D&D does.
Oh yeah, the producer and main writer of that Netflix series Black Mirror.
Oh yeah,
I remember
Charlie Brooker. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing an interview with him in 2020, right after the world all kind of got shut down and everything. And he ended the series not because it got canceled, not because we had no choice. He thought it was time to cancel it because
the world was matching up to the dystopia
yes,
too much.
yeah.
And I honestly haven't even seen the interview, but I knew as soon as you said it that way that that's what you were going to say, because
that's what he said. I
it's
mean,
an
yeah,
echoed
that
statement.
was,
I've heard it from so many. The truth is stranger than fiction. The times that we're living in, I suppose.
You can still have fun at game shops.
Exactly. Which is why
for next week,
why tabletops are so important.
So for next week, then, so for next week, then, we're gonna have a guest. I've got a few possibilities for who that guest could be. If I get my first choice, I'm hoping to get Murray on so that we can introduce the new GM. I mean, that would be like ideal. We'll see how the schedules work out, but I got multiple people I can pick from. We'll have a guest next week, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to send Rory a link to a 26-minute Kickstarted movie we're going to review for next time. Now, this is not a movie review show, so we're not. I don't think it's going to be. That's not the plan. We're not reviewing it because it's a movie review show. We're going to review it because it pertains to one of our campaigns. So there's a particular player, once you watch this, you know who you are, who made a character based on that movie. It has deeply affected some of our Mistara plot lines. So, and and then he just, deserves it to have it be drawn attention to because he's infected me and made me a fan of this thing. Um, so it's a comedy troupe that puts their stuff on YouTube. They're called Viva La Dirt League. They've got hundreds of video shorts on YouTube, but they did one Kickstarter movie so far, 26-minute long Kickstarter movie that's just brilliant. And I kind of review it for next time. And it's a movie about gaming, so it's got a whole lot of it'll be very on topic for things that we talk about on here, but we're not generally supposed to be a movie review show. But that's kind of what we're going to get into for next time. And in the meantime, I guess it's getting kind of late here in America. It's even later in Ireland. So we will have to let Rowdy Rory go to bed, get his beauty rest. and so thanks so much, Rory. It is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to more shows and for you to to help remind me not to go off like the old fart that just yeah, there's Grandpa John. He's been playing for 40 years. you know, you you need to be the hip current person to bring Grandpa back once in a while.
Well, I don't think anybody's described me as hip before, but it's definitely been a pleasure. Absolutely, it's been good crack. So looking forward to the next one.
Awesome. Well, we do them once a week, so maybe not on the same day. Just depends on when schedules pan out. But all right, and next week we will have our guest. So the mystery guest. I know who I want. We'll see who I get. So, all right. Night, day, good morning, wherever you are, whenever you watch this. So it's night for us. So, all right. In the meantime, I'll see you in game.